you.
Lizzy, so I introduced you before, but I'll introduce you again. Great senior editor at The Nation. A delight to work with Lizzy. Lizzy's also a superb writer. Wish she would write more. She's written some great profiles, great analytical pieces. And Lizzy is really an expert, if one can be, in Israel-Palestine relations and studies. So thank you, Lizzy, for doing this.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Katrina. I'm humbled, embarrassed, a little verklempt. My ego just grew like 5 sizes. So thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. And thank you all of you who are joining us here today. It is thrilling to be able to speak with you. I wish we were able to be together. Someday that will happen. But for now, I'm thrilled that we have this fantastic panel lined up. It is called Rigorous Reporting with a Conscience. Not just rigorous reporting, not just reporting with a conscience, not rigorous reporting without a conscience, but rigorous reporting with a conscience, which is what we aspire to do at The Nation, which is what I know all of you who are here with us today are aspiring to do, are doing, and hopefully will continue to do into the future, because we really need more people in journalism doing this kind of hard, righteous, committed, not easy work. So to help us hash out what precisely rigorous reporting with a conscience means, we're joined by 4 fantastic panelists, 2 of whom I've had the pleasure of working with as colleagues and comrades, 2 of whom I've just admired from afar, like decades almost, for a really long time. And each of them does some version of this conceit of rigorous reporting with a conscience, but they do it differently. They go about it differently. And that's because there are lots of ways to do journalism. There are lots of ways to be in journalism. And I hope that is one of the many lessons you take away with you today, that if you love journalism, and yes, our industry is complicated and contracting in certain ways, there's still lots of ways to do this essential work. So I am now going to switch into reading mode. I'm going to introduce you via their bios, and then I'm going to turn this over to them. So in alphabetical order, we start with the amazing Laila Al-Arian, who's an Emmy and Peabody award-winning journalist and the executive producer of Fault Lines, a documentary program on Al Jazeera. She's co-author with Chris Hedges of Collateral Damage, America's War Against Iraqi Civilians. The book is based on their Nation magazine investigative piece from 2007, The Other Way. And I remember reading that and just, my worship for Laila, that's when it began, frankly. So Laila, welcome. We're also joined by my friend, Richard Kim, who's the editor-in-chief of The City, previously executive editor at HuffPo, and he was also executive editor at The Nation, and I was deeply lucky to work with him. He's not just a talented writer, he's a brilliant writer who did time as a Nation columnist and has freelanced widely, and I'm so excited to have him here with us. 2 more fantastic speakers. Sarah Leonard, another friend and former colleague whom I adore. She's contributing editor to The Nation, formerly a senior editor and our features editor. She's the editor-at-large of Dissent, and she's the founding editor and publisher of Lux. Finally, Dave Zirin, The Nation's first ever sports editor. He's the author of 12 books. I don't know how you managed to do that. 12 books, that's a ton, on the politics of sports. Most recently, the Kaepernick Effect, Taking a Knee, Changing the World. He's been named one of Utne Reader's 50 visionaries for changing our world, and he's all over the media, and it's fantastic to have him here with us today. So now that I've introduced everybody, let's turn to the first questions. I guess my first question, you all do different kinds of journalism, you've been in it for a while. I'd love to ask each of you to talk about sort of how you understand the work you do. Can you describe for us, what exactly you do in journalism and why you do it? Is it this rigorous reporting with a conscience? Is it progressive journalism, advocacy journalism? What is it? So Is there any, I'm going to be really democratic about this. Is there anyone who wants to dive in first? Otherwise, I will call out somebody. All right, I'm going to, that's put too awkward. I'm going to call one of you out. Let's start in alphabetical order. Laila, can you start describing for us, how you understand the work you do and why you do this work?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be with you all. When I joined Al Jazeera in 2008, we used to say that we give voice to the voiceless. And then over the years, I started really thinking through what that means. And I actually started not liking that phrase because people do have a voice. And it's our responsibility as journalists to amplify that voice, to make sure that it's heard. But they do have a voice. And I felt like, in retrospect, maybe it wasn't, maybe there were good intentions behind it, but it wasn't maybe the best phrased motto for journalism. But what we do at Fault Lines, which is a documentary show on Al Jazeera English, of which I'm the executive producer, is we look at an issue for 25 minutes. We're documentary style, correspondent led, producer driven, on video, and it's sort of a hybrid of news magazine and documentary, but we look at systemic issues, usually of abuse, whether it's corporate abuse, government abuse. It really runs the gamut, and it's really about letting the people who are affected by the policy tell their stories, and then we take their pain or their stories and try to get accountability as much as possible. So just to give you some examples, we did a story about Jim Crow juries, which is about non-unanimous jury convictions. There were 2 states in the country, Louisiana and Oregon, that had non-unanimous jury verdicts. In Louisiana, it dated back to the late 1890s, and it was a constitutional convention that meant to establish white supremacy and mute the voices of Black jurors. And in effect, it did just that, and it led to the conviction of more Black people. And last fall, we released an episode about Brandon Jackson, a man who had spent more than half of his life in prison, 25 years on a non-unanimous jury conviction. And he just got out of prison last month on parole. And I don't want to take credit, but we really tried to push as much as possible to get his story out there. So it really is about rigorous journalism, fact checking, telling a story in a way that's factual, but also compelling, because right now we're competing with 50,000 other news outlets and people's attention spans. And it's about making people care, but also taking these issues of systemic abuse to those in power and holding power to account. So in his case, we talked to the DA in his district. We spoke to a Republican lawmaker who opposed changing the law. Anyway, that's a very long-winded way of responding to your question, but I think there's a lot of different ways to approach it.
Thank you, Laila. I have 20 follow-up questions because that's fascinating, but I'm going to be disciplined and I'm going to go and ask the next person. I'm going to just choose Sarah. Do you have any, can you get into to sort of what precisely you're doing, how you conceive of this work and why?
I thought you were going in alphabetical order.
I decided to switch it up. I'm sorry. I hope that's okay.
Crazy. Well, thank you for the introduction. It's really, really nice always to be back at the Nation. I think different projects I've worked on have had really different approaches to this question. And so I can speak to what Lux is doing right now. And part of our project in making a socialist feminist glossy magazine was to figure out a way to provide a gateway into the left for a lot of people who might not have one through existing media, who maybe don't see themselves in the media that's being produced on the left and don't relate to it. And can we make something that's sort of for people like us? It's very female, it's very queer. And that's a different kind of gateway than a lot of media products that kind of already exist. But then a sort of practical thing that we really care about doing, there are challenges to being a truly internationalist as a leftist in general, but also as a feminist. So for example, we all know that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were sold to us on the basis of liberating women in part. And I think a real weakness on the American left was that there were not deep enough relationships between some parts of the American left and left feminists in countries that were the targets of American imperialism. And so developing deeper relationships along those lines is something that we actually think about doing through reporting. So reporting, also, essays and like a lot of different forms of media, but figuring out, so for example, in our next issue, we have a big interview with a member of RAWA in Afghanistan, the Revolutionary Afghan Women's Association, talking about the withdrawal and, rejecting both the politics of the Taliban and the American invasion. And what those politics look like on the ground. And so that opens the opportunity for, people reading this magazine in English to begin to get an entry point into those politics, and then also to have ways of showing solidarity. So we do a huge amount of international work, actually, for a tiny little magazine. And we had another piece that called Rape and Reparations in Mexico in our first issue that was about two cases where Indigenous women in Mexico were raped by soldiers. And in the court case that ensued, they insisted that this was an act of community oppression, that these soldiers were part of repressing their entire community, and community reparations were the answer, not just sending these two guys to prison, but rather providing resources. And this was very much in line with the American movement for defund, for, an anti-carceral feminism. They're talking about Mariam Kaba. And so it's like, we can build these sorts of bridges in our analysis internationally, and, draw inspiration and practical advice from each other. So I think of that as one role of the type of work we're doing at Lux. And again, that's very particular to this project. I think different publications have done it very, very different ways.
Thank you, Sarah. So Richard, let's now hear from you. You've been at The Nation, you've been in slightly more corporate media, now you're at the city. Take on over.
So I just started my job as editor-in-chief of the city a month ago. And we are a nonprofit local newsroom dedicated to covering New York for New Yorkers. We were started 3 years ago, and one of the things the founders was noticing is like the real desert of news gathering and information in New York City, which is ostensibly the media capital of the world. And yet at the same time, the Wall Street Journal shuttered its Greater Metro section. DNA Info, which was this great scrappy neighborhood site, was bought by Joe Ricketts, I believe, and he shut it down when they tried to unionize. The New York Times laid off a bunch of people on its Metro desk and explicitly cast its Metro coverage as like local for global. So like even the city stories about New York City were sort of being written and pitched to a national and global elite audience. The New York Post was becoming increasingly, partisan. The Daily News had hemorrhage staffers. So they're really just in New York City, a city of almost 9 million people. They were huge pockets of information and news deserts. And that was the mission of the city, to fill that and to be really close to the neighborhoods that we cover. And, one of the things I discovered just in this first month is what that really means and how great that feels. So, the story that we ran several pieces on this month has been about Con Ed bills in New York City, which if you live in New York, you have probably seen that your bill is 2, 3, maybe even 4 times higher than it was. People who are living paycheck to paycheck, who had previously paid like $75 a month, suddenly got a bill for $350, $450. That is actually devastating to a household budget. And we came to this story because we were hearing from our readers, from our communities, I don't understand what's up with this bill, right? So we dug into why. And one of the explanations that, in short, is that there's a supply charge that Con Ed charges, which is the cost of the energy that they buy. It's not a price that Con Ed sets. 70% of the energy in New York City is from fossil fuels, especially natural gas. And the prices of natural gas has gone up. The US is exporting more natural gas around the world. This is also all before the invasion of Ukraine, which further drove up fuel prices. So this story of why your Con Ed bill is so high is about the largest force shaping the world, climate change. It's about global commodity markets. It's about geopolitical conflict. It's about national and state energy policy. It's actually a huge story. But where does it show up to people who are not bankers, who are not commodity traders, who are not climate activists? It shows up in your bill that you get, and you have to figure out what to do with it. So that just really was a powerful demonstration, to me, that the local, national, local, global division that we think about is actually maybe less meaningful, than we think it is, or less hard. And the way I have come to really think about the work I do and the work the city does is, we show up where the story shows up for you, how it manifests in your life, in your commute, in getting your kids to school, in your health, in your bills, in your rent. If it's troubling you and your life, if it's confusing to you in your life, we want to be there for you and for New York. And that's how I view my work and my job. And it is a very different role. I mean, Lizzy and Sarah, as you, and Dave and Laila, as you all folks know from the nation, where that has a very different sort of left political progressive constituency, and the constituency of the city is nonpartisan. It's not particularly politicized per se. We are really scrupulous about sticking, to that, and having our ear close to the ground so that we are actually providing information and news that the community says it needs.
Thank you, Richard. That was fascinating. And now I'm going to turn, even though I have 20 more questions for you, Dave, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the original question, which is, to remind you, you're like, what was that? It was just really sort of, how do you conceive of the work that you do, and why do you do it?
Wow, I was told we'd be discussing what we had for breakfast this morning, so I've been preparing that for the last 15 minutes.
You could also go with that. You could totally go with that.
It involves leftovers from last night, so I'd rather not share. It's not very dignified. Look, for about 15 years, I've been writing about the intersection of sports and politics for The Nation magazine. And when I started, doing this made me subject, and also some of my editors subject, to a degree of mockery. Like, why would sports be in a political magazine? Why would we talk about this at all? Who really cares? I was once told that my writing reminded them of seeing Dick Cheney eat a falafel sandwich, which is both old and out of date as a joke, but it was something that stayed with me over the years. And so that's the way it was 15 years ago. But now, look at USA Today, look at the Washington Post, look at even the New York Times. There are whole departments at newspapers that deal with this question of sport. They either call it the Sports and Culture Department. In some places, it's called the Sports and Race Department. In some cases, it's actually called the Sports and Politics Department. So this has been a dramatic change in my world over the last 10 years. And part of what I do, and part of what I find myself writing about a great deal of the time, is just trying to explain what changed in the landscape, so we can understand why things are so different now in this world than they were before. And, I could go into that forever about why it's changed, but really just very briefly, foundationally, the Black Lives Matter movement and the rise of social media dramatically changed the relationship between athletes, particularly Black athletes, and the broader world. And that had a ripple effect with women athletes, LGBTQ athletes, trans athletes, people drawing inspiration that said, hey, maybe this multi-billion-dollar brought to you by Nike platform can be something that we actually use to try to shape and change our world. So basically what I've been writing about and trying to catch up with over the last decade are all the ways this is manifesting itself. Because, when I started, a lot of what I was writing about, I was looking back at some of my early pieces for The Nation. It was really trying to convince people that this was a valid area of inquiry, like saying things like, hey, you can't have the civil rights movement without Jackie Robinson, or the women's movement without Billie Jean King, or the 1960s without Muhammad Ali. Let's learn from that history and apply it to the present. Now everybody's applying it to the present. So we need to figure out now strategy and what are the most effective ways to use sports to talk about the world. And so what I try to do is develop a compass about how best to do that. because I do think sports explains the world, but only if you draw opinions based upon facts, and only, I believe, if you're governed by one of the oldest cliches in journalism, which I take very seriously, cliche though it is, which is that our job is to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. And as an example of that, I wrote a piece earlier this week. I'm just want to speak about the methodology of it. And I'm not even saying this was a correct methodology in any way, but just to give you a sense of how I try to think this stuff through. Afflict the comfortable, comfort the afflicted. I wrote a piece this week, and it wasn't my first piece on this subject, but it was the attack on transgender athletes, particularly transgender women athletes or non-binary athletes. But not just the fact that they're under attack, but the way in which these attacks are actually drawing people, drawing some liberals, drawing some, I would call them as anti-trans feminists, into the sphere of the radical right, and the ways in which this attack on sports is actually being used as an entry point to some of the laws that I'm sure people have seen recently come up about accusing parents and teachers and counselors of actual abuse if they're daring to speak to transgender kids as if they're human beings and not people who should be shunned or isolated. So how do you write a piece about that? I could have written my own screed about how this upsets me in so many ways, but instead I sort of turned the column over with 5 questions to Chris Mosier, who's a Hall of Fame triathlete, trans athlete. So Chris could give voice to actually tearing apart some of the ideas that are being used to attract trans people. So that's one approach. And that approach is also governed by yet another cliche that I've kind of shifted a little bit, which is, people might have heard this, which is like if you're a reporter and one side says it's raining and the other side says it's not raining, your job is not to say, well, both sides disagree on this. Your job is to poke your head out the window and see if it's actually raining. I think that needs to be expanded a little bit to say you don't just have to say whether or not it's raining. You also have to explain why one side, against all facts to the contrary, are saying it's not raining. And what's that about? Why would somebody go outside on a rainy day and say it's not raining? And that's where you get into issues of, I would argue, class, injustice, oppression, and why some people have a vested interest in not telling the truth. And it's our job to try to wrest the truth from them and speak to it as loudly and proudly as we can.
Wow, thank you for that, Dave. I'm still kind of mulling over the falafel story in my head. Yeah. And it actually kind of leads to my next question, which is, obviously you got advice, Dave, to kind of like stop doing what you're doing, right? That it didn't have a place in journalism. And so I guess my question for all of you now is, what is some advice that you wish you'd gotten when you were younger about sort of making your way through this world? Or what was, or conversely, in Dave's case, what was advice that you got and then chose to ignore in order to kind of make your way in this shifting, complicated, sometimes stultifying landscape? And Laila, I don't mean to call on you again, but since you started so exquisitely last time, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Lizzy. No problem. I think for me, I grew up as the daughter of Palestinian refugees. We had the news on all the time. Like, I was basically a news junkie from a very young age, reading weekly news magazines cover to cover, which probably are no longer in print. But I dreamed of becoming a foreign correspondent. I dreamed of working for a major American newspaper, being based abroad, covering conflict. And it just didn't work out for me that way. And I think some important advice is, our field is so tumultuous. It's constantly changing. Organizations are constantly hemorrhaging staff, or pivoting to video, or pivoting to this and that. And it's just very important to be flexible and to maybe figure out why it is you want to be a journalist, why it is you want to be in this field, and find a way that's actually achievable to do it. Not everybody has family support to just be able to freelance write and then which is not a very sustainable way to live. So I think it's really about finding your path and being practical, because it is an extremely challenging field. So for me, after interning at The Nation, and then, as you mentioned, the article I wrote with Chris Hedges was turned into a book, I did the math and I could no longer afford to live in New York City on $0 a month. So I ended up moving to DC where Al Jazeera was hiring. And, I looked and saw like who's actually hiring. I put my resume out everywhere and just didn't get any phone call, even after co-writing a book at 25. It was a time when, again, people were just shutting down, print publications were shutting down. And I looked at the one place that was actually expanding and became a video journalist, which I never in a million years would have imagined, and I now work on documentaries. So all this to say that our field is challenging enough, and I'm not telling people give up on your dreams, but there are certain practical considerations along the way that are sort of important to think about. And one is just how do you survive doing this kind of work?
That was enormously helpful advice I wish I'd received when I was younger. So thank you, Laila. We'll go sort of maybe in the same order as last time. Sarah, any thoughts on advice you wish you'd gotten or ignored, conversely?
Yeah, I find this so hard to answer because I feel like my career, such as it is, has proceeded really sort of chaotically. I don't think there's, I couldn't advise someone to do what I did because it wasn't that strategic. I guess one thing I always say is if someone's interested specifically in being a writer, is always, if I'm talking with students or interns, my first advice is always to actually just get a different job and do that. Find the most flexible job you can, and do that as you can. And I've done that. I think that can actually be really valuable rather than putting all the pressure on your writing, which sometimes then means you have to churn out stuff you don't actually want to be working on. But really think about how you can combine different kinds of work. I think that doing work for free is considered a little, it's considered more obviously exploitive than it used to be in media. It used to be just like unquestioned that everyone did an enormous amount of free labor. And like there are plenty of places that still try to demand that, but you can find like paid internships like the Nation's. So I think, one of the useful things that someone told me at some point also that I do like to pass on is I think there's a lot of emphasis right now on trying to create things that will be extremely popular or go viral, like participate in the Take Factory. And I get that. And sometimes you do have to, and there's value in reaching a large audience and trying to put things in a way that will catch people's eye. I'm not knocking it, but writing or doing journalism in general is a craft with tools that you can learn. And I think a big change for me was when I went from Dissent, which had really, I started out at Dissent magazine, which is a political journal and really trains you in a certain kind of political thinking. And it's all about political argument. And then to go to The Nation, where the questions are much more journalistic. It's why would we write about that today? What's the news hook? How do we report it out? And that was learning a whole new set of skills. And so I think trying to do those different kinds of work and really learn it, read the people you admire most, see what they did, like read Strunk and White, like really like the nitty gritty of like learning to be a good writer, take that really seriously. Those are things. I happen to have a set of teachers who were really critical of writing and made us read writing guides and like rewrite things and cut words and simplify always. And that benefited me tremendously. And it's been surprising to me to realize as I've gone along that a lot of people never got even a fraction of that in their education, that I got really, really lucky in that. I didn't feel lucky at the time always, but I think treating it like a craft that can be learned is really important.
Thank you, Sarah. I've never read Strunk and White. It's terrible. And now I'm going to go back and do it. We have a whole bunch of questions from the audience, but Richard and or Dave, I'd love to hear if you have any thoughts on sort of words of wisdom quickly that you wish you'd gotten.
I would just echo what Laila said, which is have your dream, pursue it, but also be extremely flexible about how you get there and how that dream can change. And, what I would add to that is also, any journalistic environment I've ever been in has taught me something, and been surprising and interesting. So that includes at HuffPost in the last year, I was the executive editor, and part of that job was working with our shopping writers to produce affiliate content for Amazon, right? And is that something that I thought I would be doing at this stage in my career? Probably not. Did I learn a ton about reader behavior and commerce and the industry and data collection? I learned so much doing that. And so there are many things in our profession that, you might not immediately gravitate to or might seem a little bit unsavory, but take the time to learn why they're there and how to do it. And those skills are transportable.
And I want to get to questions too. So I'll just add that the advice that I got that I want from a guy named Jim Ridgway, who just passed away, that I want to pass along is you have to love the journey. So don't do this if it's not for the right reason. I speak to journalism classes, and I got people I'm speaking to who've got dreams of TV shows or national columns, things of that nature. And that's great. I'm not saying don't have dreams, but you got to love the journey on the road there, which is a low paying, at times drudgerous, at times incredibly difficult, at times incredibly frustrating journey. But you know what? I've loved every second of it. And if you sometimes when you love what you do, the whole idea of work takes on a different feel. If you've ever had a job where you're looking at the clock every 5 minutes, that's a version of hell. If you have something that's a craft, that's a life task to try to get better at, that you feel like you got something out of a day where you can't get anybody on the phone, then congratulations, you're a journalist.
Thank you all for those wise words. I'm now going to turn to some questions from the audience, and I want to start with one from Justin Rose, which is for any and all of you. Maybe one or two of you will take a turn at it, and then we'll move to the next question. But Justin's question is, for a young up-and-coming journalist, I believe it is hard to balance telling stories you want to tell versus ones that will get the most eyes on your writing. My question: how do you choose which stories to pursue? Do you look for a story which nobody has told before? Or do you look for ones you think will bring the most eyes to your writing? Was this choice different than when you were just starting your journalism career? So that's my first question. And I'm wondering, is there anybody whom that really speaks to, who's like, yes, I have the answer? It's
actually really hard to answer in the abstract. But if I were to wildly generalize, I would say, don't write crap because you think it will get eyeballs. Write things that you think are good and important, and then try to frame them in the most effective way you possibly can to get to the most number of eyeballs. I don't know, whenever I'm feeling a little unanchored in my work in some way, I think is this useful? Is this piece doing something useful for somebody? And if so, it's you can proceed, and then you're going to make it as snappy as you can. But I don't know. I don't think I've ever just written something because I think it would get eyeballs. I can't imagine, Dave was saying, your heart has to be in it. It has to be in the process. I've definitely written tweets for eyeballs, but not entire articles.
If I could respond by maybe just reframing the question, I think what I would say is presumably you're not just writing in a vacuum, you're writing because someone's paying you to do this, right? And they may actually be the person dictating to you whether you should write for the interest of the story or the clicks or whatever, right? So what I would say is, particularly as a young, journalist, try and get a really good understanding of why the journalism you are creating is of value monetarily to someone, right? To your employer. And then you could choose to fulfill that, to buck it, to subvert it, to transgress it, right? But have a real understanding of why the role you are filling is something that is being paid, right? And so if the answer to that is like your employer survives on advertising dollars, programmatic advertising at scale, then yeah, like what you write is going to be for clicks. How you then choose to do that and interact with that incentive structure is there are many different ways to approach that, but you got to start with the understanding of why your story is producing value for somebody.
That's actually practical, helpful advice we can use. There's a sort of a related question, which is similarly sort of thorny, but I think one a lot of us grapple with all the time. And that is by Rita Arif. And it goes like this: with the introduction of social media journalism, that is information dispelled in bite-sized ways through apps such as TikTok, etc., and audiences dwindling, how do you as journalists ensure that your pieces consistently appeal to readers and engages them? I guess the question is sort of, in this shifting media landscape, how do we actually reach readers, which is something that we at The Nation grapple with all the time. We have great pieces that sometimes don't reach readers, and pieces that are also good, but perhaps maybe that we, don't think are as explosive or necessary that don't reach readers. So how do you guys do this? Particularly curious to hear from, go Dave.
I'll be brief. You have to be counterintuitive. And I think this is something that the work that Laila does is so terrific. It's like you go after stories that otherwise aren't being reported. I think of what Laila started with by speaking about not liking that phrase, the voice of the voiceless. And it made me think of Arundhati Roy's response to that, saying that there is no such thing as the voiceless. There's only the deliberately unheard. And I think a big part of our goal is to find the deliberately unheard and give them voice, not only because it's somehow immoral or righteous or politically spot on thing to do, but also because then you're giving the reader in this incredibly congested media environment something they are not otherwise getting. So constantly having part of your brain thinking counterintuitively and constantly trying to think of whose voice is not being added to this subject matter or what angle isn't a part of this. I think you have to mine that to the best of your ability. And just one brief concrete example is, you've got this baseball lockout right now and so much noise about the baseball lockout that's taking place. But maybe ask yourself the question, like, well, what does it mean to like a Starbucks worker who's going on strike? The fact that there's a lockout going on. Do they see any connection between the solidarity of millionaire baseball players and their ability to wrest a decent contract? I mean, that's something that you're not really reading about, or trying to make those kinds of lateral connections. So I think using your mind to be able to do that and think about who is being unheard, and can I, as a reporter, provide them voice? You're also getting some new eyeballs who are like, oh, that's an angle I haven't seen before, instead of just doing what I think is a lot of media right now, which is people rehashing the same story and just trying to find little changes around the edges, instead of trying to find a perspective that's new and elucidating for the reader.
Very, very helpful there. Does anyone have any follow-up? If not, I have another question of my own. But okay, so this is a really practical question. I did freelance for a while. I failed miserably at it. But we have, now I just lost it. Give me a question. Give me a second. Okay, from Ray Wolfson. If you've worked in freelance, what are some tips you have for pitching and landing gigs? That is a hard one, or hard for some of us, not hard for others. So any of you out there have advice?
I can talk to someone who accepts freelance pitches. So I don't have personally the temperament to freelance. I'm way too anxious. I need a regular source of income. But as someone who takes pitches from freelancers, I would say be really clear on what your story is and how what you're bringing is new. So this topic has been reported. What's new that you're bringing to the table? What elements or what sources do you have confirmed to speak on the record? Just being very, very clear about what the story is, why it's important, why the publication would be interested in it. And obviously things that are like exclusive access or investigative are going to get people's attention much more easily than, a story that's already out there, as Dave mentioned, that's already being reported in many different iterations. And of course, just establishing your credentials and your background. So here's work I've already done. This is why you should take me seriously. But anyway, if someone who's actually freelance wants to jump into.
I don't freelance, but I would say, as someone who also assigns freelancers, I would say the best thing you can do is like get a beat and knowledge in it, and then learn how to slice it in a million different ways for different types of publication. So let's say your focus is on like women's maternal health, right? There's a story in that for The Nation. There's a story in that for Cosmo or Vogue. There's a story in there for The Times. There's a documentary in there for Laila. Like there's a lot of different ways you could take expert knowledge and write it for commercial magazines, for lifestyle magazines, for serious, like big investigative journalism pieces, for video. So just think about the ways that you could do that.
Yeah, I would also, I'm going to put my sort of editor hat on here. And actually I freelanced briefly. I was terrible at it. And so my one advice for those of you who enjoy it, who want to do it, who want to pursue it, in addition to the good advice that Laila and Richard provided, is be relentless. Don't be dissuaded. Don't invest so much ego in it that you think that because someone doesn't accept your pitch, there's something wrong with you, or you shouldn't do this profession, or there's something wrong with the pitch. As someone who accepts pitches, I make mistakes all the time. I take pieces, or I don't take pieces that I should have taken because I'm too busy, or just because I didn't understand the gem that was in front of me. So yeah, just stick to it if it's something you want to do, and be relentless. Don't take rejection personally, and just pitch. So that's my bit of advice there, stepping out of my role as moderator. Sorry, Dave, did you have, yeah, go.
I just want to throw one last thing for people who are freelancing is don't confuse width with depth. Depth is what I think gets you noticed. I get like a dozen a week off social media of sports, politics stories of people who are like, we should run this. And I probably send at most one to people who have publishing powers at The Nation. And that's at most one, because if I get something like, hey, I really want to write about why the baseball lockout is terrible, it's kind of like, well, that's my job. Why would I want to give you my job? But one person got in touch with me and said, hey, I think there's a lot to learn from the 1890 Players League in baseball, where there was an effort to have Major League Baseball without bosses. Then it's like, whoa, that's a piece of history we're not exactly told on ESPN. Write that up. And that got in thenation.com. That made its way there. And what impressed my editor and what impressed me about it was precisely that depth, which brought something new to the table instead of width of opinion, which you can pretty much get on social media.
Thank you. All right. Well, I want to turn for a second to some specific questions that we're getting for individual panelists here. So the first is from Courtney Bergseeker, and I'm so sorry if I'm slightly mispronouncing your name, Courtney. The question is for Laila, and it is, how do you balance reporting stories of abuse in a compelling way that doesn't commodify or exploit the pain of the people that you're reporting on? I think this is a really excellent question, and one that I have grappled with probably poorly. But Laila, I'd love to hear from you.
A very good question. It's one I think about literally in every single piece we do. One thing we've started doing regularly is putting warning slates at the beginning of each of our stories, just to warn the viewers, because you don't know what people who are coming across your work on YouTube or something might be going through. It's extremely relevant to me this morning because we're working on a story about a teen suicide. And literally the first thing I did waking up when I woke up is Googling once again the guidelines for reporting on suicide and really making sure that we're not stepping over the line. So I think educating yourself as much as possible about the abuse that you're covering in your work. So we also did a story on domestic violence and really making sure that we were aware, drug addiction, that you're not using language that's stigmatizing or blaming. We're not supposed to, for example, use the term committed suicide. You're not supposed to talk about the method or a suicide note or anything like that. So just being as responsible as possible. What I told my team right before this call, this meeting is, let's err on the side of caution over storytelling, because I think there's always that tension of like, but it could be so much better if we include this thing. No, I mean, if there's any sort of potential ethical lapse, you have to err on the side of caution. We did another story a few months ago on it was an investigation into domestic abusers and convicted felons who still kept their guns and were not told to relinquish them after having a record. So a violation of federal law. And it was, a several week edit. And, by the end of the edit, we started really thinking through, the producer really started thinking through, how would the victim's mother watch this? And, trying to really look at it from her perspective. And in the end, we actually removed one of the shots that we had of the crime scene because she couldn't sleep thinking about the victim's mother seeing that shot and just being hard. So really trying to see it through your sources, through the people directly impacted. And it's not to say that we don't make mistakes. I think we're human, we all do, but trying to be very sensitive as you do the work.
Those are some harrowing stories. Thank you, Laila, for walking through how one attempts to tell them sensitively. Sarah, I have a question for you from Hannah Beck. And the question is, as a US publication dedicated to transnational feminism, how does Lux make sure that it doesn't participate in the imperialist trend of attempting to spread US values through media?
I don't identify with US values, so it's not too hard. But I think, we're quite particular about our reporting. We're guided by a sense of radical political values in terms of the questions that we ask. So the questions we're interested in are, broadly, how do people oppose power? How do we grapple with thorny questions of interpersonal power, as in the cases of sexual assault? How do we, think about developing international feminist ties? And so for us, that's very much about a project of partly bringing information into the American consciousness, not the other way around. It's about sort of looking for comrades, which is always a question that demands equal footing, or you're doing it badly. And so for us, these are the types of questions we're asking and trying to answer. The goal is not to be spreading some sort of American value to other people. I'm not actually even sure what that would mean. I shudder to think. But I think, I'm trying to think if there's like a more concrete way I could put this. I think a lot of the value comes from the way we ask our questions and what we're looking to achieve. An example that I've been thinking a lot about is, I know some feminists in countries in the Balkans who have had a big resurgence of activity by the Catholic Church against abortion rights. And there's definitely money going into that struggle from American right-wing groups. And so I consider our job in that case to be to uncover more information about that and attack that, sort of from the heart of empire. Like, that's our job. And so I think that when you think about it in this sort of solidaristic framework, it allows for a better exchange. So that's sort of how we think about it.
Thanks, Sarah. Super, always interesting to hear your wisdom on these things and the clarity with which you approach pretty much everything. This is a question for all the panelists from Zuri Pope. And the question is, what reporters/writers inspired each of you to pursue journalism? What aspect of their work captured your interest, and how did it influence your own writing? It's a broad question, but a good one. I don't know if I myself have an adequate answer. So I'm curious if any of you were particularly inspired by people, or if you just kind of fell into this and found your way on your own. I can call on one of you. It's, oh, Sarah, I see a mouth opening. Sarah, sorry.
I can give like two like really radically different answers. Early on, I would say I really like, hear me out. I was like really inspired by William F. Buckley because he was absolutely the devil. However, he was very politically effective. And it was a combination of writing his own polemics and framing arguments, reframing political arguments pretty effectively for the right. And also commissioning and working with lots of other writers and editors to develop a really robust right-wing media sphere that really developed the American New Right. And it was really disgusting what they did, but it was a really interesting framework for thinking about political writing to me. And the sort of extreme opposite answer I might give is I probably admire Bell Hook's style of writing more than almost anyone else, because she would approach radical political questions with the clearest possible writing, like really elegant and stripped down often. And there were a lot of thorny political questions that she just cut through like a knife through butter. I mean, it's great. I refer constantly to the way she defined feminism. And I think there's something about that ability to distill politics into a way that can be accessible to everybody that's so valuable. And she did it that way because she believed in that politically. It served the political project that everyone should have access to this kind of education. It shouldn't be something that's made obscure and hidden behind academic terms, even though she was also an academic. So anyway, those are two weird answers I can give to that question.
I love that, actually. And I think the William F. Buckley one is actually great and deserves to be considered a lot more. If you just want to sort of think about how we are effective at the work we do, even if we're coming at it from a really different perspective. So I actually have one question of my own before returning to the questions from the panelists. And, you know, I'm wondering what is sort of the hardest part of this job for each of you? You know, is it, for instance, for some of you, running up against a boss or an editor or publication that won't publish you, or have you run into that? Is it just sort of getting people to care about the stuff that we care about? Is it navigating the issue of being sort of sympathetic without being boosterish or kind of, you know, fogged over by bias? So I would just love to hear what people find the hard, or is it just like freaking making a living in this profession? So what is like the most challenging, would you say, these days? And I'm gonna call on one of you in a second, sorry.
I can go. I think.
Oh, thank you. Okay, great.
For me, it's two main, there's so many challenges, but if I had to choose two, one would be the ability to disconnect. I think it can be like all encompassing. And I think, you know, you kind of have to be very disciplined to disconnect, especially when you're dealing with very intense topics. And I think for me also working at Al Jazeera English, even though I think the advantage is having so much editorial freedom, really being able to report on whatever I want to report on and not being bound to metrics, numbers. We don't have corporate sponsorship, any of that. So we can tell whatever stories really we want to tell, and there's no pressure to get eyeballs, which is great. But on the flip side, you know, if I tell a story and the New York Times tells a story, they're going to get a lot more attention and potentially impact. And for me, it can feel really frustrating to not have the impact that as a journalist you really want to have, because, you know, you're not the New York Times, basically. So I think, you know, for example, we did a story about civilian casualties in Afghanistan, you know, in March of 2020 that, you know, when the New York Times did it, obviously I had a, which I'm very happy they did. But yeah, so I would say not always feeling like your work has a direct impact. It can feel tough to keep going, but we do.
Yes, I relate to that very much. Any of you, any others want to sort of chime in on this? or not. That's okay. I actually do have a follow-up question, Laila. Somebody did ask, and I think this is relevant, sort of Nuha Abdusalam wanted to know, how do you avoid burning out on the issues you focus on? How do you avoid becoming desensitized? And so, yeah, it sort of relates to what you were just speaking about.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm the poster child for like healthy processing of harrowing stories, but I would say being able to take breaks, self-care, as even though that's become a cliche, but like exercise, really being able to have a life outside of your work. I think that's incredibly important. And I think it's also having perspective. And that's something as a Palestinian, it's drilled in you from a very young age, which is like, no matter whatever you're dealing with, there's someone else who's like dealing, has it much worse, and just trying to really express gratitude and focus on the gratitude of life and what's happening, and not focusing on, the pain.
My advice would be to not be friends with other journalists. Sorry. But
explain.
What I mean there is this. The habits and behaviors that we pursue in our industry are really weird, and they're not healthy ones, right? Like, it's not normal to like look at the number of followers you have like all day long. It's not normal to be on Twitter like processing the news, or like live tweeting the Biden State of the Union or the conflict in Ukraine. Like, that's like not a normal thing, right? And I think, I have seen journalists who only have other journalists as friends, and then like you finish your shift and you go out to dinner, and then like everyone's still doing that thing. And it's just been really great for me to have like friend circles that are like teachers, social workers, lawyers, like store owners, and like, they're just like, can you put the phone down? And can you not talk about like media gossip and just like be a normal human being? And that's just, it's a really good thing to do. So I would purposely try and cultivate, friend circles that are diverse and like not in your profession.
It's so funny. I agree with everything Richard said, but I think my advice is going to be the opposite and say, don't put the phone down, pick the phone up. Because the toughest thing about my job is social isolation and trying to figure out and the process of writing alone. And, it can feel a little intimidating sometimes when you're in front of that computer, you've got the blank page, you've got to fill it, you've got a story, and yet you're alone. And sometimes what we do, and this is in total agreement with Richard, is like we turn to social media as an escape from the loneliness of our tasks. So we find ourselves on Twitter. We're wondering what that kid from high school thinks about Ukraine and Facebook, all these things that are total, for lack of a better term, time sucks. But we do it because of that feeling of loneliness. And the best advice I got, and I say it's the best advice just because it served me really well, is by a journalist named Howard Bryant, who said to me, when you feel that kind of block, pick up the phone, have a conversation with somebody that you're either writing about or somebody whose ideas you respect, and you just want to talk to them about what you're writing about. Be collaborative in spaces that sometimes don't feel collaborative. Enforce and impose a collaborative relationship on somebody who maybe is not asking for one, but you send a couple of texts and then they respond to your call. And then just the last thing I was going to say is have quote unquote friends who you read. I never met James Baldwin before he died, but that's my guy right there. And you asked before, like, what made us want to write, and what we write about is, for me, it was reading an article by James Baldwin in college about the boxer Sonny Liston. And it blew my mind that sports writing could be more about the writing than the sports. And so when I feel that sense of being blocked, or when I feel lonely, or when I feel isolated, and when I can't get someone on the phone, sometimes it is about not either picking up James Baldwin or picking up somebody who I know that James Baldwin read, as just my own fuel to be able to see this as a noble task and to keep pushing forward.
These are incredibly wise and helpful words. I would also just chime in here to advise something that I am utterly incapable of myself, which is drawing boundaries. If you're in kind of the news business, the news just obviously doesn't stop. It goes and goes and goes, and there is a crisis everywhere all the time. And it's really hard to kind of get off the news train. And so it can be tempting to work deep into the evening and early into the morning and over the weekends. And all of a sudden, your whole life is your job and following the news. So sometimes it's really important to enforce artificial boundaries and just be like, I'm not working on the weekend, I'm not working in the night. So yeah, if my family's hearing this, they're like, you have to follow that advice too, which I don't, but I advise everybody else to do that. So we have 5 more minutes or 6 more minutes. And, maybe one good way to wrap this up is to ask you guys, how do you see journalism changing right now and your work within it changing? The media landscape is always shifting. We have new platforms, new ways of going about media. It's shrinking, it's expanding. So I'm curious to hear from you guys. Let's start with you, Richard, since you've had a bunch of different jobs in recent years, all sort of overseeing large parts of your publications. What's changing and how do we need to change with it?
I mean, I think the most powerful underlying force now is very intense media consolidation and sort of like bigification, right? So Ben Smith wrote a really great, I think it was his first column as the media reporter at the Times, just describing how large the New York Times is. It's like, it is the Amazon of our industry. It employs so many more journalists than the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, right? So, I saw a slice of that when I was at HuffPost because we were acquired by BuzzFeed. BuzzFeed went public. BuzzFeed bought Complex. Like, there is this pressure for, I think, the digital outlets to consolidate so that they could get better ad revenue, that they could compete with each other, that they could leverage better terms from Facebook and Google. And, I think the reality is, like, all of us are sort of powerless, right, to kind of stop that or change that, or, it's really, this is something that, like, a handful of people at the top of our field and private equity firms, right, sort of shape. So I would just say, like, get literate in the business end of the industry, read the best media columnists out there, not the ones that are talking about the revolving door and who's in and who's out, but actually getting at the fundamentals of our industry and the changes in it. And that will help you, no matter what you do, understand where you are and how it's producing value.
Super helpful. Scary, but helpful. Dave, I actually want to turn to you quickly, because at the beginning you spoke about how when you started out as, sort of creating this field of sports journalism, you were the only person doing it. Now it's all over the place. And on the one hand, that's great, but I'm guessing maybe at least it makes your job a little more challenging, even as it also makes it easier. So can you reflect on kind of that shift in the world, the sort of way in which issues and sort of ideas that were taboo only a few years ago are now being embraced or perhaps eaten up by larger media?
Yeah, first, just to be clear, the both what was called the Black press and the Communist Party press did amazing writing about sports and politics in the 1930s. So I sure as hell didn't do it first by any stretch, but there was kind of a 70-year break. So, but the groundwork was laid by courageous and brilliant people who saw sports as a way to explain the world. And for me, it goes with what Richard's saying. I mean, the right wing is on the march in this country, and I'm not just talking about foot soldiers. I'm talking about the billionaires who back them, pursuing a process of media consolidation that is relentless and that is ruthless. And so even though in the sports world, you now have so many other people trying to, have their say. And I think it's a beautiful thing, particularly because there's a new generation of women writers, new generation of LGBTQ writers, new generation of writers of color who are having their voice and having their say. And I read them avidly. The field is richer for it. I'm glad that I'm not having to put out a take that sort of is like the tree falling in the woods. It's great that there's the ferment. So I definitely don't look at it as making my life more difficult. What I'm looking at is the politics of what they're writing about, because there was this verve to do it particularly around the Colin Kaepernick taking a knee and then the police murder of George Floyd. You see this upsurge of the kind of writing. And then just 2 years later, I'm seeing that the reins are being pulled in a lot of cases precisely because of right-wing media consolidation. So what I would say is don't confuse width with depth, which I sort of said before, but in this context, don't confuse width with depth. And also, when you see the effects of this kind of right-wing media consolidation, I mean, you got to push back. You know, it's like you use the pen in your hand to be able to fight for the kind of space where not just left-wing ideas, but the ideas of people who are deliberately unheard are able to have a voice.
All right, we have time. Thank you, Dave. We have time for one more person to answer. So not to choose here, but Laila, since you work at Al Jazeera and you are sort of producing in a both free but also corporate, maybe slightly environment, any thoughts on how things are changing to sort of wrap it up?
I wanted to kind of end on an optimistic note.
Okay.
Because I
Love
know
it.
that
Fantastic. No, go for it.
it
That's
can
better.
feel very overwhelming to see our media changing. And to answer the question earlier about people on TikTok giving the news and how do we deal with that? The reality is they're commenting, they're not actually reporting, and there's a big difference. And I think there will always be a need for strong reporting. There will always be a need. I remember about 10 years ago, I was freaking out because it was one of these moments in our field where, again, news organizations were laying off and hemorrhaging people and shrinking. And I spoke with a family friend who said, there will always be a need for people who can communicate the news in a clear way. And it just gave me so much peace knowing that we do have these fundamental skills as journalists, and we do have these important perspectives that we need, and they will always be, even with all the social media platforms, they will always be around and always be in demand and important. And you are as good as the story that you bring and that you pitch. So really, it's the strength of the reporting that no one else is doing that will hopefully help you in your career.
Thank you so much, Laila. That was a perfect note to end on. It's almost as if we planned it, but we really didn't. So I want to thank all of our fantastic panelists today, Laila, Sarah, Dave, Richard. Thank you for being here. To all of you in the audience, thank you for listening and being part of this conversation and feeding us these great questions. Good luck with your journey through journalism, all of you. We can't wait to read you, see you, hear you, watch you. So thank you all and enjoy the rest of today.
Thank you. Thanks, Lizzy.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Bye.
Lizzy. That was terrific.